I write a lot about earthquakes. They're part of my exploration of this issue called sustainability. Getting out ahead of risk, finding out what science can inform us about something like an earthquake threat in a country that's prone to them, and what do you do about it ahead of time. And I'd written about the L'Aquila quake when it happened, because also there was afterwards there was a summit there of world leaders. And then I went on to write about other earthquakes and all the other issues I deal with. And then this year, this popped back in the news because a half dozen scientists, plus kind of a senior administrator, were put on trial, essentially for falsely sort of misleading the public there about the level of urgency. Basically, the claim was that they had said there wasn't going to be a problem, and they were criminally culpable for this. See any merit to this claim. I wrote about this on my blog on .earth. It's kind of, when you actually look at what the scientists said, they didn't discount that there was risk in that area. In fact, for years, Italian and other seismologists had been warning that this is an area that's historically seen patterns of earthquakes. There was a side issue here, that there was an amateur seismologist, essentially, a guy who worked at a science institute but had no real geology background. He claimed that radon levels in the air had led him to conclude there was an earthquake threat, although his predictions also ended up being wrong. But that got amped up in the public mind through some media coverage into there was an earthquake risk, and the real scientists said there wasn't. When you look at what they actually said, it was not that everyone should relax and go home and have a party. It was that this is an area with risk. They didn't see any signs. There was no knowledge leading to a higher probability of a quake imminently, and that's unassailable. That's the basic science. Now, as far as the administrator, I forgot his name, the government official involved, there's a separate level of questions there. And one thing that, if you look back at recent events in the New York area, like after 9/11, there were some pretty ill-advised comments made by the mayor and Governor Pataki, Mayor Giuliani and Pataki, about the safety of the conditions in lower Manhattan, when in fact in that case we didn't know. There was no scientific knowledge one way or the other. And there was this eagerness to reassure the public. So in this case in Italy, there was eagerness to reassure the public essentially that this guy who had come up with this concept or theory that the earthquake was nigh was not something that they took seriously. To then move from that to manslaughter is kind of, to me, just ridiculous.
It doesn't seem that that the scientists actually did misrepresent what they found. It was really the government officials and how they portrayed that to the public.
Well, I just think that the government officials have a higher level of responsibility for making sure not to overstate. The scientists in this case didn't say anything that I could see indirectly or otherwise leading to the deaths of people. The one thing, by the way, as I wrote in my piece, if you want to look for culpability here, look to the people who built the buildings. Many of the buildings that fell down in that quake were not the older ones, but newer structures that were built in a country that is famous for corruption and lacks attention to building standards. This happens routinely. I've written extensively about earthquake risk and losses in Italy, in Istanbul in Turkey, and in Haiti and other places. Again, if you want to look for the real culprits in terms of who died in that city, I would look first to the building inspectors and the people who were there to enforce standards, and then to the people who build buildings and those who pay for them, and maybe look the other way in terms of structural issues. There is an element here, to my mind, of searching for a scapegoat, making the scientists the villain, when in fact, to me, there's no justification there. And this leaves to the side the case of, whether there's others who might have been more responsible for some of the mayhem that happened.
In terms of risk management, does it seem to have also been sort of the role of the government to have possibly evacuated or to have planned for this a little bit more based on what they knew?
No, I don't think so, because every time there was a cluster of mild earthquakes, if you sought an evacuation, you would end up with so many false alarms that the public would be equally enraged. Maybe not as enraged because of death, but enraged because of loss of income or inconvenience. And this happens routinely with other kinds of emergency warning efforts in tornado zones, for example. The rate of false alarms is very high. In other words, in a county where there's a lot of tornado activity. Most people, when one actually happens, don't end up right in its path. So for most people, it's a false alarm. So how do you deal with those issues? They're complicated and important, but they're not about manslaughter.
Right. So I completely agree. So another thing I was thinking as I was reading this is that it seems sort of strange to apply legal standards to scientific studies, in that they sort of, you know, seek to find different things or use different standards. Does it seem like
yeah. Well, you know, the scientific standards on complicated issues can somewhat resemble legal arguments. Like for global warming, there's no simple smoking gun piece of evidence that says the world is going to dangerously warm as a result of greenhouse gas buildup. It is kind of like the summary argument of a prosecutor who says you have this evidence here, and this evidence here, and this evidence here, and when you look at that all in sum, you end up with a picture of a disruptive change that can be modulated by decisions we make. So there actually is some resemblance between how science gets translated into policy and how evidence gets translated into a legal decision. But in a case like this, again, the scientific evidence that that part of Italy was an active earthquake zone is what it is. It's just a fact. The evidence for buildings there being inadequately designed to deal with that level of risk is a fact. And the fact that an administrator made a statement that may have gone too far in trying to reassure the public that an overstatement by someone else who's not a scientist dealing with this issue was not a reason for concern. It's just basically bad luck. You know, that quake could have just as well have not happened at that time, or not. But again, to my reading, if I was on the jury, forget about it. They'd get exonerated. But there is a level of, you know, values choices there that I don't see that as a right or wrong thing. I just personally see it as a ridiculous case.